is CNN Breaking News.
So the president says he is not going to see a dime from the tax bill he is about to sign. Now, that may be true, but only if he keeps his eyes closed. John Berman here in for Anderson. The bill just hit a minor Lucy pulls the football technical snag, but is still on track for the Senate to pass tonight and the House to pass a second time by tomorrow. Based on what the president has said in the past, he might be surprised with what is in it.
This is going to cost me a fortune, this thing. Believe me. This is not good for me. Me, it's not so. I have some very wealthy friends. Not so happy with me.
Now, many of the provisions in this mammoth piece of legislation are debatable, such as how much, if at all, it will grow the economy. Estimates range from nearly nothing to the president's 4, 5, even 6%, he said the other day. You can debate who in the working and middle class has helped and who isn't, because it is a real mixed bag, although a large majority of taxpayers, some estimates are at 80%, will see some kind of cut. However, several things are simply facts. Congress's own nonpartisan number crunchers say the bill will add tremendously to the deficit, between $1 to $1.5 trillion over 10 years. The highest income earners will see the biggest gains. Corporate tax rates will drop a lot, a whole lot, and those cuts will continue even after the personal ones expire. Those are all facts. Now, what you will hear next is not a fact. In almost no conceivable world is this statement true.
This is going to cost me a fortune, this thing. Believe me. This is not good for me.
So in a moment, a very quick, non-eye glazing rundown of why this is almost certainly not true. First, how Press Secretary Sarah Sanders dealt with it today.
How does he figure this is going to cost him a lot of money?
Look, we expect that it likely will, certainly on the personal side, could cost the president a lot of money.
Unless cost suddenly means save, it's hard to see how that's true. Yes, the bill sharply cuts deductibility of state and local taxes, which could be considerable for a New York billionaire. But the top personal rate falls 2.6 percentage points for every dollar the president and Mrs. Trump earn above $600,000. And for a billionaire, that adds up. Also, there are other provisions of this bill almost tailor-made for wealthy real estate tycoons with small family-owned companies.
So he's going to benefit from pass-through deductions, top rate tax reduction, estate tax exemption is doubled. He's going to make money on that.
Look, again, this is a tax plan that we hope benefits all Americans primarily, and priority number one is middle-class Americans.
Which may be a fine talking point, but it doesn't answer the question. So our Jim Acosta gave it a try.
The president did say that this tax cut bill would cost him a fortune. That was false, right?
No, because on the personal side, this actually could impact the president in a large way.
And how would balance out corporate versus personal if he's going to come out?
I'm not sure if he's done a side-by-side, but I know that there are a number of provisions that would negatively impact the president personally. And so we contend that those comments are still very consistent.
No. But what has been consistent is the president's claim that he's the big loser. Here he is in September.
I'm doing the right thing. And it's not good for me, believe me.
Believe him or not, because there is a big change to the estate tax, which helps wealthy filers, a reduction of the alternative minimum tax, which helps wealthy filers. Corporate tax rates drop 14 percentage points, and a special provision gives big tax breaks for so-called pass-through corporations, which is how Donald Trump, the real estate developer, structured his businesses. The Trump Organization isn't really one big company. It's hundreds of smaller pass-throughs, which now would pay far lower taxes than before. So, to the extent that the president is enriched by his businesses, which you will recall he has not divested himself from, he certainly stands to do quite well. Something by the third question today, Sarah Sanders all but conceded, even as she tried again to change the subject.
Look, I said that in some ways, particularly on the personal side, the president will likely take a big hit. But on the business side, he could benefit. But the biggest focus for this White House has been to make sure all Americans are better off today after this tax package passes than they were beforehand.
Again, because of the way he has structured his businesses, there isn't always a division between business and personal. Of course, there is one way to know for sure, one way to know how much this would benefit the president, or as the president claims, would not. He could release his tax returns. CNN's Phil Mattingly has the latest on how tonight's vote is expected to play out and now how tomorrow morning's vote will play out. Phil, these problems that caused the House to have to revote, what's the latest on that?
Well, they certainly are going to postpone things a little bit. Look, the House Republicans and the Senate Republicans went into today assuming that this would be done today, tonight, when the Senate Republicans vote. Still on track to do that. But, John, as you noted, some problems cropped up, and most notably the Senate budget rules. Obviously, Republicans going through the budget rule process in order to be able to do this with a simple majority. Pass this with just Republicans, pass this in a partisan manner. The problem with that issue is there are rules that apply to that, and those rules have caught two specific provisions, and get this, the title of the bill as being problematic before it can actually move forward. So those will be stripped out. That won't be a major problem. These aren't major substantive issues that will change the core components or tenets of the bill, aren't going to cause any major long-term problems. But what they will do is force the House to vote again tomorrow morning. So while the Senate will vote tonight, while Speaker Paul Ryan had the big gavel moment earlier today in the House, he'll apparently have to do that again.
We're looking at live pictures of the Senate floor right now. I believe that's Ohio Democrat Sherrod Brown right now giving a speech. Where does the bill stand exactly right now, Phil?
Well, they're in the middle of the debate. And again, this was a debate that was supposed to lead to the final vote to clear this for the president's desk. As it currently stands, Republicans are in very good shape. I've been talking to Republican aides all day. The hang-up on the Senate budget rules, that's not considered problematic. They are very clearly on track to pass this. The big question right now is a matter of when. In terms of how the Senate's moving right now, expects a vote sometime later tonight, maybe 11:30 right now. They're trying to move through debate as fast as they possibly can. But again, there is a recognition that this isn't it. There is one more step to come.
Hey, the president wants this on his desk by Christmas. They'll almost certainly get it way before that, right, Phil?
Yeah, it's a foregone conclusion at this point, barring some unseen issue that jeopardizes the bill itself. The president is going to have a signing ceremony of sorts tomorrow. It won't necessarily be the final bill signing ceremony. They have to wait for the process to actually send that up to the White House. But as it currently stands right now, the White House planning to do that tomorrow afternoon. Lawmakers expected to go over there. This will be done, and it will be done tomorrow, something that I think a lot of us chuckled at the idea of just a few months ago, Republicans moving through the first tax overhaul in more than 31 years in just a couple of months. Not only are they getting it done, but they're getting it done on the very aggressive timeline that the president laid out, John.
Indeed, there are people who thought tax reform would be harder than health care. Health care didn't work. They're getting it away, both of it before Christmas. Phil Mattingly, thanks so much. Here, Jim Acosta questioning Sarah Sanders a moment ago. He joins us now from the White House. So, Jim, what's the latest from the White House on all of this, both the process and the substance of the bill?
Well, you heard Phil Mattingly just a few moments ago say that they're going to have this revote, so they can't break out the Trump wine at the Trump Hotel just yet here in Washington, John. But they are going to have this revote tomorrow. They are planning for this ceremony over at the White House. It won't be a bill signing ceremony, as Phil just explained, but the White House is very happy about this. You can just see it on the faces of officials here. They do have more of a spring in their step than they would normally when, say, the Russia investigation is in the headlines. But they do have a political problem to solve, John, and that is because of these glaring headlines about the president saying he is, not going to have to pay a huge tax bill in all of this. Obviously, he is going to benefit from this tax bill that is going to be passed and signed by the president. The other thing, John, is that they're going to have to deal with this issue heading into the midterms in terms of how the middle class is going to respond to this. Middle class voters, depending on which state they live in, may actually get hit with a bit of a tax increase if their state and local income tax deductions are curtailed, or if their homeowner mortgage deductions are curtailed. They may actually have to pay more in taxes in all of this.
So is the White House worried at all about the consequences in the midterms?
Not at this point. You see the president pointing to the stock market and insisting that this tax cut plan is going to result in the stock market going further up in the new year. Of course, keep in mind, during the campaign, the president, then candidate Trump, was talking about a stock market bubble and that it would eventually burst at some point. Apparently, he's not worried about that heading into the midterms. But I did talk to a GOP source close to the process in the last several minutes, John, who said and offered some framing in all of this and said, listen, if Democrats are going to oppose these tax cuts, they're essentially going to be arguing heading into the midterms for a tax increase. If they want to repeal these tax cuts, they're essentially arguing for tax increase. That is not going to be a winning issue for the Democrats, according to this Republican source. But of course, a lot of this is going to shake out in the new year when people start to see exactly what is going to happen to their tax bill, because it may not be as simple as the Republicans and the president and the White House officials as they were describing it earlier today.
All right, Jim Acosta at the White House, thanks so much. Joining us now are senior political commentators, former U.S. Senator, Republican presidential candidate Rick Santorum, and Jennifer Granholm, the former Democratic governor of Michigan, and CNN senior political analyst David Gergen, former advisor to presidents, Republicans and Democrats dating back a long, long time. David, let me start with you. This is a legislative victory for the president, a big tax bill, a repeal of the Obamacare mandate, among other things. Do you think this pays off for the White House politically?
Well, I think the president absolutely is legitimate in proclaiming a major legislative victory. This is on his timetable and basically the tax bill that he has wanted. It also sends a message that Republicans have been desperate to show, and that is that with a majority in Washington, they can govern, they can make changes, and this is, after all, what he promised on the campaign trail. I think the surprise, is as he achieves this great victory, is how unpopular it is with the country. Right. I can't remember a major achievement like this that is met with disapproval, but the CNN polls, not unlike others, 33% approve this tax bill, 55% oppose it.
Well, it isn't exactly what he promised, first of all, because he did promise to the campaign trail that he would be a big loser in this, and in fact, he's not. He promised that he would do away with cuts on carried interest, change those rules. He did not on that either. Nevertheless, Senator Santorum, to David Gergen's point, the polling on this is not good. The CNN poll says that 55% of the American public doesn't like the bill. Why is that?
Well, I'd say several reasons. Number one, I think the Republicans have done a woeful job of describing what this bill does, and the opponents have been very effective in carrying the message. And you've heard me say this many, many times. The president is not on message. He's really even with this discussion of whether he's going to benefit or not. The fact that he and the White House cannot drive a message consistently to the American public about what this bill does and the benefits of the bill to working men and women across this country, because he's distracted by other things that are going on within the White House and other messages he's trying to send, I think makes it very, very difficult to deliver that message. Here's the good news. The good news is the vast majority of Americans are going to get a tax reduction starting in January. So I'm not worried, and I think most Republicans are not worried about what polls say today. They're going to be, those polls are going to change once people see that their take-home pay is going to be up starting in January.
So what about that? Governor Granholm, because, next year when people are paying their taxes, some people in the middle class, the average is like $900 more that they'll see. One tax bracket up, they'll see an average of $1,500 to $1,800 back. When they see that money in their pockets, will the bill get more popular?
Well, of course, that ends up being spread out, right? So, but here's the deal, is that it's not just about the fact that some people are going to get a tax cut. It is really a question about fairness. So I heard somebody describe it this way. If you have 10 people in a room and you've got 10 sandwiches and you give 8 of the 10 sandwiches to 2 people, but just 2 of the sandwiches to the rest of the 8, well, those people, the 8, are not going to feel that great just because they got a bite of a sandwich rather than having their own. It's about fairness. And if they see that 80% of the benefit of this goes to the top 1%, how is that fair? And how does that remedy the problem that everybody has been talking about now for years, since the Occupy Wall Street movement, about income inequality in America? This will make us the most unequal country of all of the advanced countries. It is this historic transfer of dollars, of $1.5 trillion, from working people and from the middle class to the wealthy. Why is that helpful for the economy? It is not.
I see the thought bubble in Senator Santorum's head, the Republican thought bubble. The wealthy get bigger tax cuts because they pay more on taxes. Senator Santorum.
Well, a couple of things. First off, a lot of the benefit, and was designed this way, goes to businesses. And the reason it goes to businesses is because we have the highest corporate tax rate in the world. And it's made us uncompetitive. It's one of the reasons that companies are moving offshore and moving their income offshore and moving their intellectual property offshore, all of which is to the detriment of workers here in this country. So even Barack Obama said that we needed to reform the business tax code and we needed to lower the rate. So benefits, even under Barack Obama, were going to go to corporate America. Let's set that aside. Let's take the top 1%. The top 1% in America makes 20% of the income in America and pays 40% of the taxes in America. So I would say to Jennifer, what's fair? Should they pay 50%? Should they pay 60%? Should they not get any relief? Should they pay if we cut taxes for everybody else?
If you
should
are
we
a
actually
millionaire or
increase
billionaire,
even more
Rick,
on the top 1%?
you can't
what do you
even
want to do?
spend all of that money. I mean, come on, put it in the hands of
tax it
people
more, is
who
what
can
you're saying. They
spend
should
it
pay
to
even more.
stimulate the economy. I am saying that we should have a fairer and more progressive tax system. And to your point on the business taxes,
someone
you are
paying
right.
20%, paying 40% is
You've
not
already
fair.
said this. Wait a second. No, I am saying that we need to have a progressive system like every other country in the world does who cares for their people. Because right now, what you're going to see is that this $1.5 trillion tax cut that goes to the wealthy is going to be paid for by reforming entitlements, which means that my mother's Medicare, my mother's Social Security is going to be used to pay for a tax cut for Bill Gates. But that's not fair. But let me just quickly go back. Wait. You talked about both the corporate and the individual. Let me just respond on the corporate for one moment. On the corporate tax, yes, our rate is very high, but our effective payment, meaning that when companies take advantage of all of the loopholes in the corporate tax structure, they pay about 23%. So let's reform the tax code, yes, but let's not just do a tax cut. Let's take away all of the loopholes that are being paid so that you're not reducing the tax dollars to the Treasury, which pays for basic services for people that make us who we are as a nation, which is we should be caring for one another.
That gets to the word which has not been spoken yet and is barely spoken at all in this discussion, David Gergen, which is the deficit, and the federal debt, which by some estimates could go up between $1 trillion and $1.5 trillion over 10 years. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when this was a major defining, unifying issue for the Republican Party. And now it seems to be out the window, David.
Well, that's absolutely right. And Leon Panetta was on this program last night, saying basically that it's going to be a lot more than $1.5 trillion added to the deficit there. And we can go into that argument. But let me point out why I think it's going to be harder to have this bill win approval next year. It relates to the deficits. If the Republicans are now going to turn around, as they're saying they're going to do, and say, well, we have such large deficits in the country now we really need to reform the entitlement programs. In other words, we want to cut Medicare and Social Security. And we're going to do that because we have these large deficits. That is not going to make this tax bill, which brought the help to increase the deficit, it's not going to make it very popular. When people see that in this tax bill, there is this removal of the mandate on health care, and as many as 13 million Americans could be without health care insurance as a result of this. That's not going to make it more popular among working people in this country. So, and whether the economy is going to be able to sustain this or not, that's going to be the big gamble. If President Trump and his team are right, if he does get 3% growth, that's going to help enormously politically. If this is a sugar high, as his Democratic opponents believe, that also is going to make this tax bill something other than a major political success for the president.
Senator?
Yeah, I would say this. First off, that I don't think you're going to see Donald Trump reform Social Security or Medicare. He said very, very clearly he doesn't want to touch either of those programs.
He also said he wouldn't give himself a tax cut. He also said that he was going to deal with the carried interest here. So he says things.
Well, look, I think, obviously the president doesn't get everything he wants in any bill, and he didn't get exactly what he wanted in this bill. As you know, this was written primarily in the House and Senate. Certainly the president had some oversight, but this is a congressional process, not a White House process, and they got what they could get the votes to pass, not what Donald Trump wanted, and that's the way it works all the time. Look, on the other issue that this is somehow going to be a huge increase in the deficit. This is just a fundamental difference between whether you believe that lower taxes, putting more money out there for businesses and individuals to be able to grow this economy is going to result in actually more revenue and less expenditures coming out of Washington, D.C. And I can tell you, I've talked to a lot of Republicans, both the House and the Senate, and they believe that this will produce the growth that's necessary to more than offset the deficit. And, if they're wrong, then they're going to be held politically accountable for it. But I don't think anybody's going in there thinking, hey, we're doing this and we think it's going to hurt the government, hurt revenues. We think it's going to cause more spending in Washington. I think just the opposite. And it's just a fundamental difference in belief.
Look, history has shown that tax cuts don't necessarily lead to growth, which offsets
Yes, and
or
so
pay
do
for
economists say that.
Well,
Jennifer,
every economist does. Look at this. Yeah, okay, you got to go.
Governor, Senator David Gergen, we'll call you the czar for that purpose. Thanks so much for being with us. Again, you're looking at live pictures from the Senate floor. This is Ohio Republican Rob Portman now arguing for this tax bill. We are expecting the Senate vote shortly. We will keep our eyes on it and our eye open for any possible drama that may emerge. Coming up for us, a member of the House Intelligence Committee says she is hearing that the president may fire special counsel Robert Mueller by this Friday. I asked Congresswoman Jackie Speier about it. The interview next. All right, we are watching the United States Senate right now. Ohio Senator Rob Portman arguing for passage of the big tax bill. The Senate will vote shortly. We are watching this tonight, and we'll keep you abreast as news develops. In the meantime, breaking news tonight, Donald Trump Jr. stoking a conspiracy vibe over the Russia probe in remarks to a student group in West Palm Beach, Florida. Listen to part of what he said.
Imagine what would happen if we roll back the clock to 2008 and a conservative director of the FBI and high-up people in the FBI that were leading all these investigations wrote an email about in an insurance policy, the dossier, in the unlikely event that Barack Obama was elected president. What do you think would happen? Do you think the media would cover that? Yeah. Do you think it would be brushed under the rug like, oh, it's nothing, it doesn't mean anything? There'd be revolution in the streets. So I'm glad that this is coming out now because it is good because real people have to see this. You know, my father talked about a rigged system throughout the campaign and people are, oh, what are you talking about? But it is. And you're seeing it. There is, and there are people at the highest levels of government that don't want to let America be America.
Meanwhile, Congresswoman Jackie Speier, a House Intelligence Committee member, told a local TV station that she worried for the future of the Russia investigations on Capitol Hill and within the FBI. This is what she told KQED last Friday.
I believe that the president wants all of this shut down. He wants to shut down these investigations, and he wants to fire Special Counsel Mueller. The rumor on the Hill when I left yesterday was that the president was going to make a significant speech at the end of next week, and on December 22nd, when we are out of D.C., he was going to fire Robert Mueller.
Now, I spoke with Congresswoman Speier just before airtime. Here's that conversation. Representative Speier, this rumor on the Hill that the president is going to fire Robert Mueller by this Friday, is that still what you're hearing?
Well, I certainly heard it last Thursday. It's been tamped down a little bit, in part because the president himself has been asked the question and he has said no. But it's not as if the president doesn't change his mind from time to time. So it's a great concern to me, and I think to many of my colleagues, that this is the kind of action that could be undertaken by the president. And we want to put him on notice that it is something that we will not tolerate.
What was this based on, though? Were there any facts to back this up? Because I've heard from a lot of critics over the last few days that suggest, it's reckless for a member of Congress to spread rumors about such a sensitive subject if it's not based on something solid.
Well, I made the point when I was talking to a local reporter back in San Francisco that this was a rumor. And I specifically said that. I'll say it again tonight. But rumors have a way of becoming facts in Washington, D.C. So if this has any kind of a prophylactic effect of making sure that this idea, if it was hatched, is not pursued, then I feel that it was worth making it known to the public.
It was one of these things, though, over the last 5 days since this came out, it's been Democrats saying that the president was going to fire Robert Mueller, not the president, not his team, not the White House, and Republicans saying, no, he's not going to, we don't want him to, but it's been something that was largely fueled by your talk of this rumor.
Well, that's correct. But again, all you have to do is look at what has happened in the last 2 weeks. The way the Republicans in the House in particular have, through the Judiciary Committee, started to cast aspersions on the Mueller investigation. Looking at these emails and texts that were released, talking about the emails that they now argue have been obtained illegally by the Mueller investigation of the transition team. This is a concerted effort to undermine the Mueller investigation. Make no mistake about it.
The comments from Donald Trump Jr. today, which seem to be stoking some conspiracy theory. He suggested there are some people at the highest level of American, power that don't want America to be America. Do you think comments like this are trying to undermine the investigation?
Well, I can't speak to what Donald Jr. said in his speech tonight and what he's really referring to. What I can say is that the American people trust that we are going to make sure the rule of law stands the test of time, that we are going to speak out and make sure that the Constitution is respected and upheld. And anyone who tries to mess with our system of government and with the Constitution is going to hear loud and clear from the American people.
You sit on the House Intelligence Committee. What can you tell us, if anything, about Deputy FBI Director McCabe's testimony today before your committee? What came out of that?
Well, I can't obviously speak about the classified interview that took place. I can just tell you that I believe that the FBI acting director was, in fact, very forthcoming, was willing to answer virtually all of our questions with the exception of a couple. And I think that his testimony is very helpful to the investigation.
Your colleague, the ranking member, Democrat Adam Schiff on your committee, says that he is worried that Republicans will try to shut down the House intelligence investigation by the end of the month. Is that something you see?
Well, we're very concerned about that. These interviews now have stepped up in their pace, 2 or 3 in the same day. I have been in the Intelligence Committee offices all day long today, and it is a pace that you can't keep and also, I think do a good job. There's other interviews that are being scheduled outside of Washington, D.C., which make it very hard for us to vote on bills and also be at those very important interviews as well.
Congresswoman Speier, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Up next, the president on Twitter today calling the Washington Post fake news. What's it about this time? Reports that the president considered pulling Neil Gorsuch's nomination to the Supreme Court back in February after private comments criticizing the president's attacks on the judiciary. We will hear from the reporter who broke that story when we return. Another day, another fake news claim from the president about reporting he doesn't like. This time, it's a story first in the Washington Post that the president considered withdrawing the nomination of Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court after the judge privately criticized President Trump's attacks on the judiciary. Well, the Washington Post reporter who broke this story, Josh Dawsey, joins me now to talk about that. So, Josh, the president was not too fond of your reporting. This is what he wrote today. He wrote, a story in the Washington Post that I was close to rescinding the nomination of Justice Gorsuch prior to confirmation is fake news. I never even wavered. Am very proud of him and the job he is doing as a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. The unnamed sources don't exist! ! How do you respond?
We stand by our reporting wholeheartedly. We worked on this for quite some time. We gave the White House plenty of time. We fact-checked the anecdotes. We did on-the-record interviews with officials, as you saw in the story. And we were pretty rigorous in piecing together these scenes of how he reacted to Judge Gorsuch criticizing him. So we stand by our reporting 100%. The president obviously has a right to his opinion, and we have a right to publish what our facts lead us to believe.
So let's talk about the reporting itself. For months, the president has boasted about his pick of Neil Gorsuch for the Supreme Court, but you are reporting that behind the scenes, it was on the verge of going awry. What happened for the president to waver on this nomination?
Right. So in meetings with senators on Capitol Hill as part of the confirmation process, Neil Gorsuch criticized the president, or at least the president's comments on the judiciary. And his goal was to show some independence and say, listen, President Trump nominated me, but I am my own man. And this is how I feel about issues, particularly the president's sharp condemnations of jurists and judiciary. The president was not expecting the criticism. He was taken aback to see it on television, and he vented to aides on several different occasions that he did not think Gorsuch was grateful for the appointment, and that he could not believe that after appointing him, he had gone straight to others and criticized the president. It was a moment of deep frustration for President Trump.
It's been well reported about how much the president values loyalty, or requires loyalty, you might say.
Right.
From what you've learned, how close was he to actually pulling the nomination?
Right. Well, that's a tough part, John. He certainly said to others that he was considering it. He made it very clear that he was very unhappy with the situation But the president, as we and others have reported, often vents. He will get very spun up in a situation or in a moment and make grandiose promises or vow to do things that he ends up not doing after he calms down. I think like all of us, sometimes he gets angry and then he calms down. We do not have reporting to indicate that he, called the Senate or went through any of the formal machinations to rescind the nomination. Just that he told some of his advisors, hey, I might take this guy back. What do you think?
Yeah, only the president knows for sure if those threats were for real, if he actually meant what he said. Finally, Supreme Court nominees asserting their independence from the president. I mean, it is something that ultimately happens. Based on your reporting, was this something the president just wasn't prepared for?
Yes, it was something the president wasn't prepared for. Some of Neil Gorsuch's sharpest defenders, Chuck Grassley, among others, wanted to see independence. The judiciary is one of the three co-equal branches of government, and you expect some independence. Presidents tend to pick folks who have the same judicial philosophies that they do, but independence on certain rulings and certain comments from the president. That said, the president really disdains public criticism of himself. Several of his advisors have told me and other reporters, it's been pretty documented heavily, that one way to really tick the president off is to criticize him publicly. He does not like to hear criticism. And that's what Gorsuch did. And it was early in the administration. His advisors did not tell him to expect that. And, all of a sudden he was turning on TV, looking at the newspapers. Here was the guy who he picked for the Supreme Court who was now telling senators, I don't agree with the president.
Josh Dawsey, great to have you with us. Keep digging.
Thanks for having me.
Next, breaking news in that horrific train wreck in Washington State. Also, why technology that would have prevented it, something that's been called the single most important rail safety development in more than a century, was not in place to save the day. A day after the Amtrak derailment in Washington State that killed 3 people and hurt more than 100, we have learned the train was speeding around a curve, 80 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone. We're also learning new details, including where the conductor was when the train derailed, creating a horrific scene with part of the train dangling off an overpass. Kyung La joins us now. Kyung.
Well, John, we're learning many new details, and that lead conductor, he wasn't in the cab. He wasn't at the controls. That's according to a news conference that the NTSB held. One other part of the investigation that the NTSB is focusing on is trying to retrieve every piece of evidence. What you're looking at there is what is left of a passenger car. That just gives you an idea of the horrific force of a train derailment. The NTSB says that they are no closer yet to understanding exactly why, but getting more details about the moments before the crash. The NTSB says at the moment Amtrak 501 derailed, the train's lead conductor was in the passenger section, not in the cab. Instead, the engineer and a conductor in training were in the cab. The engineer still allowed to operate the train.
Under Amtrak policy, he couldn't operate the train unless he was qualified and familiar with this territory. So the answer would be yes. Within the previous 2 weeks, he had been qualified to operate on the territory.
But the NTSB says the crew did not hit the emergency brake before the derailment. It was automatically activated. More information, but still no answer why. On its very first run on a new passenger route, the train sped at 80 miles per hour. Much faster than the posted 30-mile-per-hour speed limit for the curved section of track. Investigators already recovered both of the train's black boxes. And they also know this. Life-saving technology called Positive Train Control was not activated on this brand new passenger rail line. PTC forces speeding trains to automatically slow down.
The locomotive was in the process of getting PTC, a system of PTC installed, but it was not yet functional.
Positive Train Control won't be the only safety question.
I'm an advocate for safety. I'm not so concerned about the cost. If you can't afford to do it the best way through our community, I'd rather not have it there.
Lakewood Mayor Don Anderson and his city council fought to stop the train line, citing safety concerns. $180 million in federal stimulus money spurred Washington State to move the passenger line from the sparsely inhabited coastline directly through towns like Lakewood and over Interstate 5. Anderson warned just 2 weeks ago that disaster could be coming.
Come back when there is that accident. You try to justify not putting in those safety enhancements.
Maybe you didn't predict this exact thing, but to have seen it coming.
You know, there's a certain degree of guilt associated with it. Maybe we gave up too soon.
You feel guilty?
Not intellectually, but emotionally. We don't like to lose. And maybe if we'd won, things would have been different.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Kyung, I understand the train was outfitted with cameras both inside and out. Have investigators seen that video?
They haven't been able to look at it fully. The NTSB, though, highly interested in what was happening inside that cab. If there were two people inside that cab, the engineer and this conductor trainee, what were they doing in those moments before the derailment? Was the engineer distracted? Why didn't they hit the emergency brake? Did he see the curve coming in the train track? So a lot of questions that the NTSB has. They're hoping the cameras might shed some light on it.
A lot of work to do. All right, Kyung La in Washington, thanks so much. Coming up, the recent arrest of Sarah Palin's oldest son for allegedly beating up his father, the latest sad twist for that family. We'll take a look next. New trouble for the Palin family. Sarah Palin's oldest son, 28-year-old Track, was arrested on charges including assault for allegedly beating up his father. This is the latest chapter in a book that has been both dramatic and tragic. Randy Kay reports.
They billed themselves as the all-American family. Sarah and Todd Palin, and their 5 children, Track, Bristol, Willow, Piper, and Trig. But what we saw during the 2008 campaign and what we know now are worlds apart.
Did you know that she was sexually active?
No, and that is why it was shocking.
As the family's fairy tale started to unravel, Bristol Palin tried to move past it.
I just want to go out there and just promote abstinence.
But then came her on-again, off-again engagement to her son Tripp's father, Levi Johnston. A long, drawn-out custody battle ended with Levi spilling dirt on the Palin family.
If she's going to go out there and say stuff to me about me, I'm going to leak some things on her.
With the election long over, the Palin kids found themselves caught up in a series of very ugly and very public fights. In 2010, then 16-year-old Willow Palin went after a fellow student on Facebook after he said he was hardly impressed with the family's new reality show. She hurled homophobic slurs in response, calling the viewer gay, demanding the student quit talking blank about her family.
In 2014, the whole Palin family made headlines after a bloody brawl at a party. Police in Anchorage, Alaska had to break up the fight. A hysterical Bristol Palin tried to explain the insanity of it all.
My little sister come up to me and said some old lady just pushed me. She just hit me. Okay. Oh, no one's going to touch my sister.
Bristol also said the owner of the house where the party was taking place went after her.
I walk back up. Did you push my sister? And some guy gets in my face, pushes me down on the grass, drives me across the grass. You this, you. I get back up, and he pushes me down on the grass again and pulls me by my feet. They took my $300 sunglasses, they took my shoes, and I'm just left here.
No charges were filed. And just when you thought it was over, more drama. In 2015, Bristol Palin, who reportedly made hundreds of thousands of dollars as a spokeswoman for a group that promotes abstinence, announced she was pregnant again.
The cool thing about putting your faith in God is He certainly is a God of second chances and third and fourth and fifth chances. I screw up all the time.
Last year, after Bristol gave birth to her second child, the baby girl's father, Bristol's ex-fiancee Dakota Meyer, sued for custody. A judge later awarded joint custody to the couple. Also in 2016, trouble for Sarah Palin's oldest son, Track. He stole the headlines this time after being arrested for striking his girlfriend with his fist. He took a plea deal, and many of the charges were dropped.
Randy Kate with me now. Randy, didn't Sarah Palin try to explain last year why her son acted that way toward his girlfriend?
Absolutely, John. After Track Palin was arrested for hitting his girlfriend, his mom did come to his defense. Sarah Palin said that her son was suffering from PTSD after serving overseas in Iraq. She actually called his arrest the elephant in the room and said her son and the other war veterans come back a bit different. That's her word, and they come back hardened, she said. Track Palin spent a year in Iraq after enlisting actually on September 11th. But despite all the pushback and all of these explanations, the drama, John, continues, and the hits just keep coming. In this latest attack on his father, there hasn't been any public explanation from Sarah Palin or any of the Palins, in fact, about Track's behavior. All we know is what his father, Todd Palin, told police, that Track Palin had been drinking and was on some sort of medication, John.
All right, Randy Kay, thanks so much. Coming up, the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee is warning that Republicans are trying to shut down the committee's Russia investigation. I will speak with Congressman Adam Schiff about that coming up. Breaking news tops the hour. We are waiting for the Senate after a minor legislative snag to vote and pass the biggest tax bill in a generation. They're debating it right now on the Senate floor. You're looking at live pictures. This is consequential for most taxpayers, more so for businesses and very wealthy taxpayers. Consequential for the deficit, too, and if you believe the rosier scenarios, maybe a big boost for the economy. In any case, the president and his party are counting on this to be a big political boost, which remains to be seen for a number of reasons. One, new CNN polling showing the president's approval rating at 35%, a new low for the survey. And take a look at this. The president has the lowest job approval of any president at this point in office, going all the way back to December 1953. Now, as for the tax plan that he will sign tomorrow, whatever you think on the merits, it too is strikingly unpopular. Just 1 in 3 Americans support it right now, which no doubt makes for interesting uncertainties ahead for a White House that's about to celebrate its first big legislative victory. More now from CNN's Jeff Zeleny, who joins us from the White House. Jeff, what is the latest from there tonight? Still confident on how this all will play out?
John, good evening. The White House is very confident how this is playing out. They're watching this debate, of course, unfold on the Senate floor. But an aide told me a short time ago that this is largely just a pro forma. They are watching this, but they are not worried at all. They know they have the votes that they need. It's interesting, though, John. A few weeks ago, President Trump talked again and again about getting Democratic support on this, Democratic votes on this. That will not happen. We do know that the Democrats are opposing this lockstep. Republicans, though, they do believe they have enough votes on this. And one reason we know, I am told by an official here that they are planning a celebration ceremony tomorrow afternoon here at the White House. They've invited Republicans from Capitol Hill up here to celebrate the passage of what is going to be the biggest legislative victory. Now, of course, they have to go back to the House and have a vote tomorrow morning if it passes the Senate tonight. But all that is just procedure. The White House is intending to take a victory lap tomorrow. The president will not sign this bill at the time. It won't be quite complete. He will at some point, if not before the holidays, right after. But tomorrow afternoon, Republicans are expecting to be here for what will be a celebration, John.
So they will get to celebrate tomorrow. The question is, will they be celebrating 11 months from now? Any worry inside the White House about fallout in the coming election year?
Look, that is the central question here. We now know that this will be the soundtrack of the 2018 midterm election campaign without question. The race to define this bill is already underway, and it's going to center around the president. Will he benefit more than middle-class Americans? Now, he has not released his tax returns, as we know, so that is something that is preventing this White House for saying definitively if he's going to be better off personally or not. But the White House is hoping to get that increased support number up. We saw the poll there a second ago. 55% oppose it, 33% support it. They believe with promoting this, the president plans to travel next year in the early part of January, selling the benefits of this. They believe that will come up. But John, the reality here is some people are going to be affected by this in negative ways here. So it's a very open question here. Next November, by that midterm election time, this will be seen as a good thing or a mistake tonight.
Yeah,
John.
By the way, I don't think there's any debate about whether or not the president will be better off from this tax plan. He will be. He will make money.
As a businessman, for sure.
As a businessman, for sure. All right, Jeff Zeleny at the White House, thanks so much. Sure. As we did say, the bill had a speed bump late today in the Senate. CNN's Phil Mattingly joins us now with the latest on that and what it changes. So, Phil, even though this is essentially a done deal, we're looking at Democrat Bob Casey of Pennsylvania on the floor tonight. They're going to take this to the mat late into the evening, correct?
Yeah, no question about it. Look, this is their last shot. They know the writing's on the wall. You can talk to Democrats, and this is the same for the House and the Senate. They know that there's no stopping this. Unlike the health care effort, their ability, both from the grassroots side of things and from the lawmaker side of things, to kind of pull Republicans away from the rest of their conference, get them to oppose this, didn't work out. They are unified, and they are set to pass this with 0 no votes. However, Democrats continuing attacks about the merits of the bill, and now somewhat personal attacks. Take a listen to what Senator Sherrod Brown had to say on the floor just a short while ago.
So this tax cut, just follow it simply. This tax cut raises, it causes a huge budget deficit to give money to the wealthiest people in the country, creates a huge hole in the budget. And who's going to fill the hole in the budget? Not the lobbyists walking in and out of Senator McConnell's office 100 feet down the hall. They're not going to pay for it. They're not going to have to pay for it.
And John, I can tell you Senator McConnell's office didn't appreciate that. One of his top advisors tweeting out shortly after Senator Brown's comments, "Dear Senator Brown, apparently decorum escapes you." Again, Republicans know where they are on this bill. They're very confident about what happens next. But the frustration you've seen from Democrats about the partisan process, how this is all played out, certainly being laid bare on the Senate floor right now.
So what does happen next, procedurally speaking, Phil?
So the Senate should pass the bill, will pass the bill in a couple of hours, likely around 11:30 p.m. Again, it's a foregone conclusion in terms of where they are on the votes. But as Jeff noted, procedural issues have popped up because of the budget rules Republicans are using just to pass this by a simple majority. There will be specific provisions, none that will kind of attack the core of the bill, but small provisions that will be stripped out. Because the House passed a different version, that means the Senate will have to send the bill back to the House. The House will then pass the bill again tomorrow morning. Again, at this point, it's just adding a couple of hours to where everybody knows this is going to end up. But for Republicans who are planning on celebrating tonight, they've got a couple more hours to wait, John.
All right, Phil Mattingly up in the Senate. Thanks so much, Phil. Want to bring in our Money and Power panel. Mark Lauder, Dylan Ratigan, Kirsten Powers, and Matt Lewis. We'll let you guys decide who's money and who's power. Kirsten, I'm going to start with you. This is the first major piece of legislation that the president will get passed. So in that sense, it is a win. They will celebrate tomorrow at the White House. But how long will this celebration last, given the unpopularity of this bill, at least as we sit here tonight?
Well, I think the Republicans would say it's unpopular because the Democrats have demagogued the bill, and that when people get their paychecks and they realize they have more money, that they'll be happy with it. But the reality is, you know, whether you're ideological or not, there's a lot to be concerned about in this bill. And I think that while there will be tax cuts for pretty much everybody in the early days of this, you know, the only ones that are permanent are the ones for people who are more well off. So over the long term, I think that, you know, people are going to sort of see what's really in the bill. They're also going to see a disruption in the healthcare market because the individual mandate's going to be repealed. And I think that people can see that what's going on here, which is that, you know, this is a deficit busting bill that's going to be paid for, you know, pretty much by the middle class. And so, you know, I don't think over the long run they're probably going to fare very well. Maybe in the short run, you know, they can do okay, but I think over the long term, this is not going to be a great idea for them.
You know, Matt Lewis, not only is the bill itself unpopular right now, but the president is unpopular. I mean, historically unpopular, epically unpopular, 35% approval rating right now. Again, Kirsten was just talking about the short term. In the short term, do you think this gives him an opportunity to redirect the trajectory of his presidency?
Absolutely. In the short term, he now has points on the board. He goes from having what looked like a horrible year, especially if you talk about tweets and chaos, to having a pretty good year. If you look at the metrics, if you look at the points he puts on the board. Was it Keynes who said in the long run we're all dead? This is the short term. Donald Trump needs popularity now. Republicans need success in midterms. It's not too soon to start thinking about Donald Trump's reelection. And look, anytime any political party has ever done anything worth doing, certainly in this political environment that's highly partisan, it's going to be unpopular. It's very difficult now. It would take tremendous political leadership to do something of this magnitude. I mean, look at Obamacare. Look at the effort of George W. Bush to fix Social Security. If you want to change something, if you want to use your political capital and implement your party's agenda, and they do believe that tax cuts are going to stimulate the economy, there's going to be a backlash. There's going to be some pushback to that.
It did cost both George W. Bush and Barack Obama.
When have tax cuts ever been unpopular? I mean, this is kind of a little bit unusual, actually.
Yeah,
I mean, really,
Ryan,
if you're cutting for taxes
today,
for people,
Paul Ryan claimed today that the Reagan tax cut was unpopular at passage. We got to go back and look at that. But by and large, they are wildly popular when they go through. You know, Mark, to you, we've listened to Republicans for years talking about how increasing deficits is a terrible thing. Debt is bad. Deficits are bad. Yet now the Republicans are pushing through this bill, which will add anywhere between $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion to the debt over 10 years. So what about all that talk about deficits being bad? Is this just Republicans saying, never mind?
Well, no, I think those are the facts that are ignoring that this is going to grow the economy.
But
it's going
how do you
to
know
increase.
That? How do you know? Because there's no.
Look at history. If you look at history,
you look at history. That hasn't been the case. You look at history.
Go back to the Reagan tax cuts. 8 of the next 10 years, government revenue was higher after the tax cuts than it was the year that the taxes were cut. You had 15 million jobs
the
created
deficit
per
was
capita
way higher,
income.
The debt was
that
way
was a spending
higher
problem. That was not a revenue problem.
It's a money problem.
We can control the spending. If you keep Republicans in control, you'll control the spending. But this is coming down to the fact that you're going to have Americans getting more money in their paychecks in February. They're going to see it. Anywhere from $150 to a couple $100, you know, for the average family of 4. Starting in February, they're going to be able to spend that. They're going to be able to put that toward their kids' education, take a vacation, whatever it is that they feel like they need to do for their family. And that is something that the Republicans can run on. And if the Democrats are going to turn around and go, we're going to raise your taxes, which is what they're talking about, they're going to lose in 2018 and in the future.
So, John,
go ahead, Dylan.
Well, here's where this tax bill loses credibility, and this is why I believe it's so unpopular. There's an extremely sound argument to increase the available pool of money in the private sector, whether it's with wealthy families, small businesses, corporations. Understand, money moves down the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance is where the taxes are the lowest and where the benefit to the person with the money is the highest. If you really want to have money flow into the economy, you would create a tax benefit for the investment in new business formation, for the investment in capital expenditures, equipment, for new hiring. Absent a specific incentive to invest the capital in jobs, CapEx, and new business formation, the path of least resistance for new money in the private sector is into the bank of those who get the money, into stock buybacks, and into executive compensation. And so where this loses credibility is you're saying, I want to raise the taxes on the blue states by reducing the state and local income, which reduces budgets for schools, reduces budgets for infrastructure. Mark and I talked about that the other night. I'm going to raise the deficit. But the reason I'm willing to tolerate the reduction in the budget for schools, the reduction in the budget for infrastructure to increase the deficit is because there's going to be so much private capital flowing into the economy. It's going to create jobs. It's going to be invested in CapEx. It's going to be invested in new business formation. However, that is not what the policy does. The policy instead enables the path of least resistance for the capital to flow into the banks, into stock buybacks, and into executive compensation. And if you really wanted to do something interesting, what you would do is you would actually look at the marginal increase in the amount of private capital that's going to be now available because of this tax reduction, and look at the percentage of that capital that gets distributed through buybacks, executive comp, and the banking system, as opposed to that which gets invested into new business formation, CapEx, and job creation, which is the basic conservative thesis that I completely agree with, Mark.
But let's not forget that this bill does include a benefit for companies that invest in companies.
What we have heard from CEOs, Mark, when polled by Gary Cohn, among other people, is he asked CEOs to raise your hands if you were going to do anything other than reinvest these wages, you know, in buyback dividends and things like that. And no one raised their hand. No one we've heard from substantially yet is saying this is necessarily going to go back into the economy in the form of wages.
Because it's missing that final piece, John, which is the incentive to invest the money.
Remember, this tax plan also includes an incentive that allows companies to write off all of their capital expenditures in the coming years. It closes and penalizes executive compensation and abuses of that. There are many factors in this tax bill which aren't getting a lot of coverage, but that do encourage companies to put this into new equipment that will raise wages. And that's why we're confident the Council of Economic Advisors says just the corporate reform is going to increase wages about $4,000 in the coming years. So on top of the tax cuts, you're also going to get increased wages.
Kirsten, again, that remains to be seen. That will have to be proven. That's
I'm just saying that's why it's so unpopular, John. Is people can buy the theory of private capital, but they want to know that the private capital is going to be driven into hiring and CapEx.
Kirsten, one of the issues that came up today at the White House briefing was how this affects the president directly. The White House is continuing to make this claim because the president said all during the campaign and during the fall when he was trying to sell this, I'm going to be a big loser here. This is not going to help me. That's really just not the case, is it?
No, it's very clear that the people that are going to do well in this are people who have a lot of money. And by all accounts, he has a lot of money. So I think he's going to do well. I think, look, the problem here is that the economy is doing well already. Companies already are sitting on a lot of cash. So the argument that we need to somehow do something for these companies so that they have cash doesn't really make sense. And just to be clear, I don't have a problem with that. I actually don't have a problem with lowering the corporate tax rate. I don't have any sort of ideological opposition to this. I do have a problem with blowing up the deficit in order to help people who already have cash get more cash. It just doesn't make sense to me. You know, and again, the fact that they made the tax cuts permanent for the very wealthy people, but guess whose tax cuts aren't permanent and expire? It's middle class people. So this just looks like something that has been done
when you're
to
a
help
Republican
rich
coming
people
out in future years,
and to you know, put us in bad position in terms of the deficit, which we saw this all with Reagan. I mean, you were talking about Reagan earlier. Well, we know what happened. He left with a massive deficit.
Soviet Union.
Well, no, look.
We beat the Soviet Union. That's what happened.
That,
but look,
by tax cuts? I mean,
there
tax cuts
were
beat the
tax cuts
Soviet
during
Union?
Reagan, the deficit went up. There were tax cuts during the Bush administration, and the deficit and the debts went up.
Yeah.
There were extraneous circumstances there, but that is what history has shown. Matt Lewis,
and we had a recession.
And I want to leave this with you, Matt Lewis, because you talk a lot about politics and perception here. And I know, as a conservative and Republican, you support the idea of tax cuts, you know, in general, and much of what is in this bill. However, you know, is there a perception problem baked into the cake right now that $900 for the middle class, if they're lucky enough not to live in California, New York, or Maryland, you know, might change for voters going forward?
Yeah, look, I think that what's the old Thatcher maxim? First you win the argument, then you win the vote. Republicans have won the vote here, but they didn't win the argument with the American public. Now, I do think that, again, once people start seeing personally that they're going to get some extra money back, and once, if the theory holds true, the supply side theory holds true, and the economy is stimulated, and there's more growth, then they'll win the argument, right? So this is actually a great test. If Republicans are wrong, if this theory of supply side economics is wrong, it worked for Reagan, it worked for Kennedy, but if it doesn't work this time, they deserve to lose. But I think that there's a shot. I am worried about the deficit. I think Kirsten is absolutely right about that. That is a legitimate concern. But this stuff about class warfare, about worrying that some rich guy's going to get a bigger tax cut than me, I think that's overwrought, and I think it's the media has helped sort of spur that along.
If that's true, you would think the White House would just say, yes, the president's going to save some money on taxes here. He's got a lot of money. He's going to save a lot of money. Guys, thanks so much. Good discussion. I appreciate it. As we continue to follow the developments late into the night on the Senate floor, we're going to speak with a top member of the House Intelligence Committee who's worried about what he sees as growing efforts to stymie the Russia investigation. Later, breaking news in the deadly train derailment in Washington about where one key crew member was and wasn't, and crucial safety equipment that could have been there but wasn't. Full-throated pushback in the Russia investigation, attacks on special counsel Mueller, attacks on the FBI and Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein. Now add the president's eldest son and namesake to that list, Donald Trump Jr. This evening in West Palm Beach, referring to those FBI personal texts, the Steele dossier, and slamming what he seems to think is a double standard where his father is concerned.
Imagine what would happen if we roll back the clock to 2008 and a conservative director of the FBI and high-up people in the FBI that were leading all these investigations wrote an email about in an insurance policy, the dossier, in the unlikely event that Barack Obama was elected president. What do you think would happen? Do you think the media would cover that? Yeah. Do you think it would be brushed under the rug like, oh, it's nothing, it doesn't mean anything? There'd be revolution in the streets. So I'm glad that this is coming out now because it is good because real people have to see this. You know, my father talked about a rigged system throughout the campaign and people are, oh, what are you talking about? But it is. And you're seeing it. There is, and there are people at the highest levels of government that don't want to let America be America.
People who don't want to let America be America. Joining us now, Congressman Adam Schiff, the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, thanks so much for being with us. What's your reaction to what Donald Trump Jr. just said?
Well, he apparently forgets the fact that in real time what happened last year was the director of the FBI talked about an investigation into Hillary Clinton even 10 days or less before an election, but did not tell the country that there was also an investigation going on of the Trump campaign over a far more serious matter. That is whether individuals of the Trump campaign had been suborned essentially as agents of a foreign power. So for the most consequential difference between how these investigations were handled, it cut very much in Donald Trump's favor. And that seems to be something that Donald Trump Jr. would rather ignore.
He says there are people who don't want to let America be America, suggesting there's some kind of conspiracy perhaps to undermine his father's administration. Is there any conspiracy like that?
No, but you have to realize this is, I guess, a Trump family characteristic, and that is to always view themselves as the victim of something, victim of a rigged system, victim of an unfair FBI, victim of unfair press coverage. This seems to be a genetic trait. But the reality is that I think our FBI and our Department of Justice have a lot of really dedicated public servants whose work is being maligned right now because there's an effort to tear down those institutions, to tear down what Bob Mueller may find, to discredit it in advance by casting doubt on the integrity of these institutions. In the meantime, of course, they do enormous damage to our democracy and undermine public confidence in the administration of justice.
Trying to undermine Robert Mueller's investigation. There are questions that you've raised about whether the Republicans in a way trying to undermine what's going on, even in the House Intelligence Committee. You have an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal today where you say you've made progress, but you also say Republican members have posed challenges. Explain that.
Well, there are a number of steps the Republicans are taking which don't make sense from an investigative point of view, and they're a departure from how we have operated in the past. Probably the most graphic example, they've scheduled key interviews out of state, including one tomorrow, when we have another vote on the tax bill, and we have a vote potentially tomorrow to keep the government open. So why would they be scheduling interviews out of state if they simply didn't want us to be present during the interviews? Now, these are interviews with witnesses that we've been asking them to bring in for months, and they've sat on. So what is the headlong rush to do it now, if not to try to end the investigation? And that's my fear. We saw on display in the Judiciary Committee last week an effort to discredit Mueller, discredit the FBI, discredit the Justice Department, to shut down Mueller. We're seeing in our committee, in the Intelligence Committee, an effort to bring the congressional investigation to a premature conclusion. And that ought to concern all Americans who want to get to the truth.
Is this something that either the chairman of the committee, Devin Nunes, who I know isn't involved with the Russia investigation, or Mike Conaway, who is running the Russia investigation for your committee, have either of them said to you that they are trying to shut this down soon?
Well, they've been, I think, fairly vague when I ask, why are we scheduling witnesses 3 a day when it took months for you to schedule some of the witnesses we've asked for a long time ago? Why don't we have these witnesses that you're scheduling out of state come before our committee after the holidays? Why are we not scheduling any interviews for the new year when there are dozens of interviews to be scheduled? I can't get an answer. And that tells me that there may very well be marching orders from the top that they got to bring this to an end. And we have seen Steve Bannon, the president, and others amp up the heat on Congress to shut us down. Now, the Republican senators have acknowledged the president weighed in with them to try to get them to shut down their investigation. The House members have not been willing to comment about whether they've received similar pressure from the White House, but they certainly seem to be acting that way.
They're acting like they're being pressured from the White House. I want to play you something that we heard from the former Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper. Obviously, the entire Russia investigation, at its core, is a question about whether Russia tried to influence the election, whether Russia has undue influence on the Trump campaign and maybe at the beginning stages of the Trump presidency. This is what DNI Clapper, former DNI Clapper, said about phone calls between Vladimir Putin and President Trump over the weekend.
I think this past weekend is illustrative of what a great case officer Vladimir Putin is. He knows how to handle an asset, and that's what he's doing with the president.
Do you think President Trump is an asset to Vladimir Putin? He's treating him like some kind of intelligence asset?
Well, I think the president is allowing himself to be manipulated by Putin. Putin knows because the Kremlin does a psychological profile, I'm sure, of world leaders, what the president's strengths and weaknesses are, and knows, because this is sort of in plain sight, that flattery will get you just about everything with this president. And so in his year-end comments, Vladimir Putin talks about how great the American economy is. And why are some people in the United States questioning the legitimacy of his election when, of course, the Russians would never interfere in our affairs? These are talking points that could have been written by Sarah Huckabee Sanders. But the president of Russia, Putin, understands how to push this president's buttons, how to get this president to do effectively his bidding, and praise is the way to do it. And so in that respect, it is a bit like the relationship between a case officer and asset. You need to know the motivations of your asset, what will get the asset to do the things you want. I wouldn't push that analogy too far, but the reality is I think Putin is using all of the tactics you would expect him to use. The only surprising thing is how well they seem to work with the president.
Congressman Adam Schiff, we know you have an unexpected tax vote tomorrow morning, so we'll let you go and get some sleep here. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
All right, speaking of buttons and pushing and presidential psychology, today on Twitter, the president took on the Washington Post with another claim of fake news. The report in question that the president considered putting Neil Gorsuch's nomination to the Supreme Court over his private criticisms of the president's attack on the judiciary. I'll talk this over with Maggie Haberman next. So this morning, the president tweeted yet again that a story he didn't like in the Washington Post was fake news. This is the tweet in question. He says, a story in the Washington Post that I was close to rescinding the nomination of Justice Gorsuch prior to confirmation is fake news. I never even wavered, and I'm very proud of him and the job he is doing as a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. The unnamed sources don't exist. Well, the Washington Post reported the president was so angry with Neil Gorsuch after he privately criticized the president's attacks on the judiciary that he considered withdrawing the nomination altogether. The report said he was venting angrily, the president was, to advisors, worrying that Gorsuch would not be, quote, loyal. That's the key word here. CNN political analyst, New York Times White House correspondent Maggie Haberman joins me right now. And Maggie, that's the bigger issue here. We know that loyalty is something that is of the utmost importance to this president.
Right. Look, I mean, especially to the issue of his tweet that the sources don't exist. I've worked with two of these reporters. I'm confident the sources exist. Right. And this is often what he says is people aren't actually real. Look, this is, as you say, on its own, we knew at the time that he was unhappy with what Neil Gorsuch had said and what leaked out about what he had said. We knew the president was frustrated. This takes it a tick further, but I think your point that there is a larger issue of how the president views relationships, right? Everything is sort of this one-way street of loyalty toward him. I mean, the way he views loyalty isn't even that, you know, he'll be loyal back because he gets rid of people all the time. It's that he expects people to pay some sort of unending price if he gives them something. And this is where he conflates himself with the institution he serves. Making an appointment for a Supreme Court justice is certainly something that I suspect justices feel gratitude toward the president who does it. But it is not supposed to be something where you have some personal fealty. He was actually preserving the institution, Neil Gorsuch, by saying what he said. And the president just can't see it that way. We heard this word loyalty come up repeatedly in the campaign. We've heard it come up repeatedly in the presidency. My colleagues and I heard about it when the president was looking for a replacement for James Comey, the fired FBI director. He asked people about potential replacements. Will this person be loyal? That was the word. He clearly views Jeff Sessions' recusal, the attorney general from the Russia-related probes, as disloyal to him. He described it as unfair to the president in an interview with me and my colleagues over the summer. But this is the continuum on which this all exists.
It's curious to me, though, because if Jeff Sessions is not loyal enough, you know, James Comey obviously wasn't and got fired. But you know, Rex Tillerson reportedly called him a moron, right? Gary Cohn criticized him quite publicly for the Charlottesville speech. I don't consider those to be acts of blind loyalty necessarily, yet those guys are still around.
Well, I think let's get together again in February and see if those guys are still around. I mean, in all seriousness, look, the relationship with Tillerson has never been good, or at least it was good very early on for a limited amount of time, and then I think it was not very good. The relationship with Gary Cohn has never repaired, and did Gary Cohn get the job that he wanted, which was the Fed chair? He did not. So, I mean, I just think that these things have some nuance and gradation. I think it was important to John Kelly, the chief of staff, to keep a continuum of top advisors and cabinet positions filled through the first year. I think that once we get past the first year, you will see some change. I think the president is aware that he can't just get rid of everybody. And again, to be clear, he didn't pull back the nomination of Neil Gorsuch.
Correct.
He vented about it to somebody. He vents all the time about all manner of things. Part of this, the asking people questions about whether he should have done something, sometimes it's venting, sometimes it's just how he processes something. Sometimes he actually is thinking of undoing what he did, and you almost never know exactly what he's thinking.
Which is why you get all the kinds of rumors that have been going around for months about Robert Mueller and whatnot.
Correct.
These discussions may very well be happening.
Correct.
He may not mean, going to the full extent on them or not. We are at a key point in this presidency right now. It's almost the end of 2017. He's going to get this tax bill through. He will sign his first major piece of legislation. And one could reasonably ask the question, well, is this a pivot point? Is this a chance for the president to change how he behaves?
I mean, we've had so many pivot points that we've gone in circles, right? I mean, he's not going to change how he behaves. I think that we have that. Let me rephrase that. I think it's very, very unlikely that he is going to change how he behaves. I cannot see this being what gets it done. If anything, he takes things that are perceived victories for him as confirmation that his approach worked. So I don't see why he would change how he's doing things from this. This bill, we've got to be really clear about this. The main reason this bill got done, I realize that there are a lot of victory laps being taken by various people at the White House. And to be sure, the president should feel happy that this is major legislation that got through. Whether it's a problem for Republicans down the road, I don't know. But Republicans on Capitol Hill acted out of essentially fear and self-preservation. They needed to have something done so they could go into the midterms saying, look what we did. That's the main reason this got done.
Because the president, in some ways, is away. They need something independent of him, even though he needs to sign it. One of the things we often see before the end of the year is a news conference, right? It's very possible the president will answer questions before the press in a very public way. This could be interesting this time. I mean, there's a whole lot of Russia to ask about. There's a whole lot of Roy Moore you could ask about. There's a whole lot of sexual harassment stuff to ask about here. I'm very curious to see how he handles that.
I think that he will probably, if he does do it, I think that he will probably handle it the way we have seen him handle similar lengthy news conferences. Remember, there was that one that he did very early on against his aide's advice, where he took questions for almost an hour. He loved it. It felt to him like a venting session. I think some of what he does here will depend on where things are with this investigation and how much he is buying into the strategy that his legal advisors have prescribed at this point.
Maggie Haberman, great to see you. You just set a date. We have to get back together in February to talk about who's
and not a moment before then. That's when we'll do it.
We're taking a break, Maggie. Thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate it.